Is it just us, or are parents of autistic kiddos constantly blamed for their child's diagnosis? From the refrigerator mom theory to the helicopter parent theory, we can't tell you how many times we've heard accusations hurled towards parents blaming them for their child's autism diagnosis. Are they all bogus? How should we respond? We'll dive into this and more in today's episode. But before we get started, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for reminders of upcoming streams. Let's get started. Hello, Embracers.
Welcome back.
This is a topic that kind of hurts my heart a bit.
Yeah.
And my brain.
All right.
Because it's definitely frustrating.
More emotional because it's like a personal attack on you yourself kind of thing.
Well, it's just so misguided, I think. And I think that's the part that has to be like really frustrated because I don't really know what the intention is behind somebody blaming a parent for their child's autism diagnosis. Because I don't see what good could possibly come from that.
No, I think it's often like if there's a behavior that's witnessed that's like non-desirable, they want to point fingers at like, oh, okay, who is responsible for kind of like teaching them or them like learning that skill. And like, obviously, like you have like kids and then parents. So it's like, oh, like, okay, the kid must have gotten it from the parent kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that, when it comes from a good place, I tend to be more lenient when people try to give advice and stuff like that. But what we're talking about in this episode is more that experience that is, I guess, more of a negative. So the interaction, you can tell by talking with that person that it's not really coming from a well-meaning place. It's coming more from like an accusatory place where that person might be like looking down on you or shaming you because they think that you are misparenting your child, or they think that you are the cause essentially of your child's autism diagnosis. And one of the theories that has been out there is called the refrigerator mom theory. That one came about in prevalence in like the 1940s. And essentially, the theory behind that was, oh, your child is autistic because you as a mother are too quote unquote cold to them. So, like, since you're cold and you're distant and you're not like a warm parent, hence refrigerator, then you're directly the reason why your child developed autism. And had you raised them differently, they would not be autistic. And to me, that is just like such a toxic thing that you could do to parents who are already struggling raising an autistic child to then just blame them for everything.
Well, to me, it sounds like that solution is like people trying to simplify something and just picking like, oh, that is the cause without any like additional like backing on it. So, I mean, like, I guess it kind of, because that's kind of the argument between what, like nature versus nurture kind of thing, that
Yeah.
that is kind of like, oh, this is the impact of being kind of cold and distant. But then if like that were the case, you think that that would be a like significant portion of individuals because not everyone is like warm, considerate, nurturing, all that. I mean, it's kind of a give and take. So, I mean, I feel like that's a simple response for someone who just wants to kind of like point a finger at like, oh, you're a bad parent kind of thing.
I think one of the issues is when it comes to that nature versus nurture argument, I tend to run into people who seem to think that it's 100% one or the other. And that's where you kind of get into these murky waters with these sticky situations because the nature people are like, 100% it is only due to their brain neurology and absolutely nothing else. Therefore, nobody could take any responsibility whatsoever. You're just born that way and that's that. And then the nurture people are like 100% it's how you raised your kid, has nothing to do with their neurology, it has nothing to do with their genetics. It's 100% you are to blame as the parent for how you raised your child. And I feel like it's more in the middle. Like I feel like there's definitely that genetic component. I think there's definitely that like nature component of it, but I also think there is some nurture component to it. Because, I mean, if you think about it, if there wasn't, what would be the point of any of the therapies? The whole point of the therapies is you're teaching them to deal with some of these problematic areas like pica. Is it pica or pica? I always say it wrong. It's pica,
Pica.
right?
Yep.
Yeah.
You're
Like
good. You're good.
pica or elopement or things like that. Like if it wasn't possible to influence it through nurture, then you wouldn't have success in therapies. So obviously there is some nurture involved and obviously there is some nature involved because there's enough studies showing the genetic links or the links with ADHD and other neurodivergencies and things like that.
Plus, the other thing is like, what is the cutoff for like when it officially is like, oh, it becomes like autism? So it's like nurture at 49%, nature like is like the cutoff. Like, I mean, it has to be somewhere like in the middle. Like you said, I mean, I don't think it's absolute either way. But yeah, there's so many other elements. Like you could have a distant or cold parent, but you have a, I don't know, a football coach, a teacher who is very like loving and caring and kind of takes you under their wing, a mentor. So I feel like it's not a all or nothing, and it's not an all or nothing for the parents as for the parents as well, because like there's other people involved in like our kids' lives, and they have impacts on them, which would also kind of tie into the nature versus nurture. I mean, like grandparents, aunts, uncles, they all have relationships with the kids, and that has an impact on their overall development as well. So, yeah, I feel like it's more definitely more gray area than just a simple black or white absolute on either side.
Yeah. And I think from our experience, the area that is frustrating for me the most is when people say things like, oh, the only reason your kid is a picky eater is because you don't expose them to enough food options, or you're not stern enough in forcing them to try new foods, or you're not successfully basically trying to introduce these new foods. Like it's on you for failing at that as a parent. And that's extremely frustrating for me, especially as somebody who has like food aversions. I know intimately what it's like to be on the other side of that. And it's 100% not the parenting.
Well, I mean, not necessarily from like a parenting perspective, but I mean, I'm thinking of like foods that I've tried to have like you try and you like absolutely like despise and like will not like cross
Oh
that.
my gosh, the oyster. I
They're
cannot
good.
believe
They're
you made
good.
me eat an oyster. I cannot. I think I am literally traumatized from that.
You're good. You're better for the experience.
No, definitely not.
But like, I mean, my thing is like, okay, so let's call you a like full grown like adult, and you're struggling with like these like eating things, let alone like a like child. So I mean, I feel like it's not like a like necessarily like a phase of overcoming some of these things. I feel like sometimes you just flat out like aren't able to, just because of the circumstances of like, I mean, in the case of the oysters, I guess that might be pretty easy, like the texture, the gooey, like the
Oh my
but
gosh, it's so disgusting.
yeah, but I mean, like, I'm I'm not sure if we will ever get to a point like where you'd be like, "Yep, I'm gonna
Nope.
have some
Nope.
some
I
of
will never
those."
touch one again. I'm traumatized from oysters.
Right. So I
Yeah.
kind of think of that like with our kids, like if we're trying to get them to try something and they absolutely, regardless of how many times we've tried it, will not touch it because of the texture, the grittiness,
Smell.
taste, whatever. I mean, you can kind of see like, okay, this might be something that they will never like or like really never try in their life. And I mean, at the end of the day, I'm okay with that. Like I'm willing to accept like, okay, not everyone is going to be a huge fan of oysters. I think they're fantastic, and the less you eat, the more there are for me.
I
So
was
it's
about to
kind of
say you can have them all.
yeah. So I
Yeah.
mean, it's just I guess that's just how kind of life works with I mean, food preferences and that goes.
Yeah, I think the other issue for me has been in the area of like elopement, where people think that we over coddle our kids when it comes to it. That's that more helicopter parenting. So people are like, oh, if you put more boundaries and then just let them go and kind of let them explore and learn on their own, they wouldn't elope. They wouldn't run away because they wouldn't feel the need to run, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's just crazy talk to me. I'm like, no, if I let my kid go out of my sight or I give them enough rope to like do whatever they want without me being able to be like at arm's reach, they will just get into harm's way. They will run out into the middle of nowhere. They will run to strangers, which we've seen. They will go to like adult men that they don't know, which is extremely risky. They will just do things like jump into like bushes that have thorns or try to jump off a cliff, which has actually happened. So I definitely am not ashamed to be the quote unquote helicopter parent.
And I think for me, the elopement thing is kind of a give or take. Like it's not. It depends on the location where we're at and the circumstances that are associated. Because I've felt sometimes I ease up a little bit with like the elopement, like where I need to be like right next to them at all times. But I feel like that's depending on the location where we're at. Like sometimes like I'll insist like, nope, you girls are like holding my hands like across like whatever parking lot or where we're at. And then sometimes I'm like, okay, I'm going to give you like a little bit of leeway based on what I've kind of witnessed. So one example is like at some of the parks that we frequent, we've kind of gotten to a point where I feel like we've allowed for a little bit more freedom, distance, independence, if you want to call it that, where they're kind of able to go off and we don't have to kind of like hover around like the exterior, making sure that they're like nowhere trying to escape. We have a little bit of flexibility there. But like, for example, I went to a like pre-dance recital thing, but like I was like,
Rehearsal.
yeah, rehearsal, that's what, there we go. But I made sure like they were like with me. I was like, no, we're not like wandering off. Like this is like our first time here. We have no idea where anything is. And they like want to go in all directions, but I'm like, no, like we need to all stay together until we figure out like what's going on. So I feel like that kind of, I don't know, changes a little bit depending on the circumstances.
Yeah, and I think for me, the biggest thing is just people's perceptions of these decisions and these like life choices when it comes to parenting autistic kids. So to us, we think it's a very reasonable safety precautions. To the outside world, for people who are not familiar with autism, they see that as like overbearing, overprotective, restrictive, paranoid, all these like negative connotations that then get placed on the parent. And because of those negative connotations, they tend to hurl those insults of like, the only reason they're autistic is because you're overbearing. The only reason that they're autistic is because you're overprotective and you don't let them learn. Things like that really get under my skin because it's the polar opposite relationship. It's because they're autistic, we are doing these things.
Or my favorite is like the snarky like comment like, oh, we know that they're an elopement because you've mentioned it. And it's like, well, sometimes we want to make sure like everyone is on the same page, so we will like kind of like make a comment like, oh, like they are kind of an elopement risk, so just like keep an eye out for them. And someone will come back with kind of like a like snarky comment like, oh yeah, we're well aware of that, like we've taken precautions. And it's like, okay, like we're not saying it like because we're like judging you, we're saying it as like a friendly reminder, like just a heads up, like they might just start running and you got to be like ready to like kind of chase after them depending on what's happening. So I feel like that's kind of a little bit more like kind of like knife in the side a little bit, where it's like people perceive it as a negative like judgment or something, and you're just trying to be more helpful, or at least we are.
I think even worse than that is when they deny it, like not deny it, but they basically are like, oh well, when they were with us, they never eloped, or oh, we've
Right.
never seen elopement. We don't think they're an elopement risk, and they kind of say it in such a way that they're not directly negating what you're saying, but there's a heavy implication that they're negating what you're saying, like they don't believe you.
Right.
And I feel like I get the impression that behind closed doors, when they're having conversations with their friends, they're probably like, oh, you won't imagine these parents. They totally suffocate their kid and think that they're an elopement risk and blah, blah, blah. Like, I just feel like that's what happens behind closed doors.
Right. So yeah, those are never fun, and that's kind of like where you just got to kind of like sit back and just be like, like I don't know, like just kind of roll with the punches a little bit, because you're like, okay, this is like a unfortunate situation because obviously we're getting the judgment for how we are, I guess, trying to protect our kids, and they don't find the same need or the same necessity to take the same accommodations to do that.
Yeah. And I feel bad for parents because there are parents where this happens to an extreme case. So there are parents where, like the child, for example, if they're more on the severe end of autism and self injurious, for example, they might get child protective services called on them. They might go through the actual judicial system and the system will not believe them. The system will think that that person abused their child or that person was negligent of their child, and they don't fully understand the extent of autism and the fact that, yes, there are autistic individuals that do self injure and self harm. There are autistic individuals that will cause things to appear like the parent was responsible, but it wasn't. And that to me is like really scary, because what do you do in those situations? You can only do so much to defend yourself, but at the end of the day, it's whether or not they believe you, basically.
Right. And that's what I was going to say. Like, I mean, if you're like in an apartment and like your child has like a like constant like screaming problem, whenever someone hears like a child screaming, they immediately think like worst case situation, like, oh, this child must be being abused, being hit, whatever. And so, I mean, obviously, that's when you kind of run into a situation of potential like like police being called as a result. So it is, I mean, and not to say like there aren't those circumstances like where that is a valid situation, but it makes it challenging with autistic children because depending on what the issue is, I mean, like our kids are quite loud most times. Like
Yeah.
they don't have an indoor voice. It's very, very loud and lots of screaming. So I mean, someone could hear and think that like, oh, these kids are like getting like a punished or something. But I mean, like obviously that's not the case. It's just like they're fighting with their sister.
Yeah, it's awful because people will blame the parents for that child's behavior. They don't understand what an autistic meltdown is, and they think one of two things. They either think you are hurting your child in some way, shape, or form, and then they'll call CPS on you, or they'll think that your child is basically spoiled and that they basically are the head of the house and they just walk all over you and that you are basically negligent and just let them run wild and do whatever they want. So neither of those are good implications, but it's honestly what we've run into in terms of people's opinions or perspectives on that sort of behavior. And it directly impacts us and parents like us because when we had our kids and we were looking to move into our own place, initially we could not own a home because we couldn't afford it. So it took us like what, a decade to be able to save up enough to get a down payment to finally own a home. And during that time, we basically had to struggle trying to find like basement apartments to live in because we knew that if we tried to go to your standard apartment, there were high chances that we would get kicked out or we would at least have the manager knocking on our door all the time because our oldest child at the time struggled with severe meltdowns. So that was something that we weren't willing to risk, and it was a factor that influenced the direction of our life.
And not to mention, like, even if your child is having a meltdown, like usually we kind of give them some space. Like we'll say, like, oh, okay, do you need to take a break? And like our kids now are kind of at the age where they'll kind of go into their room and they'll kind of just like kind of recover a little bit on their own because as far as like self-soothing. But initially that wasn't the case. They would be just like screaming in their room, which also puts the parent in a bad situation because if you are in an apartment, your options are either I let my kid try and self-soothe screaming or I try and like give in, which could be like the thing that leads to additional like either meltdowns or additional like upcoming tantrums that you kind of blend the two together because you're constantly trying to have to give in because you just want the screaming to stop. I mean, that could also be a potential problem because down the road, if you're constantly caving in with any type of rules or pushback that your child might have, that can cause all sorts of problems.
Yeah, not to mention any potential damage of property during that whole situation.
Right.
Yeah. So that's definitely something that we have run into. And I've also seen other parents have run into that dilemma of like, well, where can I live if people's perspectives on autism are so skewed that if I go to these apartments or I go to these public facilities, I will basically be judged and extremely harshly because, again, they can bring the law on your door. So that's something that I feel like still needs a lot of awareness when it comes to autism. So I always talk about autism acceptance and how we need to go beyond awareness to acceptance. But I think in that particular case, there just isn't even awareness because people have no idea that, hey, this could be a kid with special needs. And when you're dealing with that, these are potential outcomes. It's not even something on people's radars, I feel like.
Yeah, I wonder if it's almost like if you are in that situation where you have neighbors that are very close together, it almost kind of forces you, I would assume, kind of out of your comfort zone where you would almost need to like force like to or like to meet your neighbors, but basically like educate them on what autism is so that when they hear meltdowns or anything, they're kind of like, oh, okay, I remember my neighbor. They're a good person. Like, this is clearly like a meltdown. This is not like the child is being beaten or anything. But I feel like most of the time, parents sometimes kind of self close off and they don't like to go out into society, not to mention bring like additional attention to themselves. So I feel like that's kind of like a weird balance where it might be beneficial to get to know your neighbors and get on good terms if you share a wall in like an apartment building, for example, or if you live in very close proximity. I mean, it seems like a very uncomfortable like conversation if you're not like ready for that conversation, but it might be the difference between police knocking on your door and like the potential neighbor having an understanding for what the situation is.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's heavily dependent upon how that person receives what you say. So they have to be receptive to the message, but you can try. I mean, there's no harm in trying because if you don't try, then your chances are zero. So it's better to try and hope for the best. Another assumption that I've seen that really grinds my gears is the assumption of your child being autistic because you chose to vaccinate them in infancy or because of whatever you ate or did not do during your pregnancy. Those two really bother me because, first of all, when you're pregnant, like, do you really need that on your shoulders? Like, you're already going through so much developing a child, and most of the time, women are sick, uncomfortable, like, unable to do things you normally could do, miserable. The last thing you need is to go through 9 months of that, and then at the end of it, people are like, your child is autistic because you didn't have enough gummy vitamins while you were pregnant, or you were out in the sun too long.
You should have had a Snickers, Leah.
You should have had a Twix instead of a Snickers, and you did it on a Sunday instead of a Tuesday. Shame on you. That
Right.
really drives me nuts because there's so many people that come up with all these wild theories as to why your child is autistic, and a lot of them are surrounding like the pregnancy, and they'll be like, "Oh, it's because you didn't eat garlic," or "Oh, because you were on your feet too long and that caused your child to be autistic." There's no research to back any of these theories up. It's usually just people who just say things that tend to be related to like old wives' tales that just for some reason don't go away. But that definitely is something that I've personally found frustrating, especially as somebody recently pregnant, because you're already miserable. And if you're like me, who was extremely ill, so I had that hyperemesis that was extremely significant, had me in and out of the ER. I lost like 21 pounds at the end of the pregnancy. That is also something that people blame parents for having an autistic child. So that they're basically saying, because you were sick while you were pregnant, it is now your fault that your child is autistic as well. Not taking into consideration that people with hyperemesis are going through trauma and that people with hyperemesis even end up having to either go through like infant loss because of the severity of the illness, or they themselves end up basically losing their own lives because they get so dehydrated if you start off at a low weight that there's nothing left. So this is really not what you should be telling people who have autistic children because you don't know what they've gone through to even have that child in the first place.
And then the thing that they're telling you is just kind of gobbledygook. Like it's like, oh, you had 3 lemons. That's what's causing your child to be autistic. And it's like,
You
I
should have
mean,
had 4.
well, but like, what I think is like, okay, so if whatever the claim is that is causing it, I feel like the diagnosis for autism is not that large that it would be like, because you think, okay, if it's I'm just using
It
like
doesn't
lemon,
correlate with the amount of people in that
right?
group is
You
what you're
think that it
saying.
would be like, yeah, you think like it would be like one in like half the population would be autistic then, because like chances are that pregnant women having X, Y, and Z, there has to be a larger portion that are doing that and having a like non-autistic child than the ones that are doing it. So it's just kind of like, okay, I'm not really sure how
But like,
much validity that has.
let's say it's true. Like, let's say that if you have 3 lemons while you're pregnant, it causes your child to be autistic. That parent didn't know that.
Right.
They didn't know that at the time. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had the 3 lemons. So there's still no reason to blame them because it's not like they intentionally went in with the intention of being like, ah, ha, ha, I'm going to cause my kid to be autistic just because. So
Right.
I just feel like that's really unnecessary. And I don't really understand what the goal is behind accusing people of causing their child's autism. There's not usually a positive intent or outcome. It's not like they're giving you advice on how to reverse the autism, quote unquote. So I just don't really get why you would do that to another parent.
It's like they're trying to get people to like rally against people eating lemons. Like
The
in our scenario.
anti-lemons.
Well, like I'm saying, like it seems like they're trying to like collect a group of people who are all upset about whatever it is just for the sake of being like upset. And it's like, well, okay, but like for for what purpose?
Yeah.
Like,
So, what do we do in these situations? For us personally, we like to deal with hard situations with humor. That's just who we are and what we do. Like, even as we've been talking about this topic, we are kind of joking about it because we don't take life too seriously. And that's worked really well for us. I can't recommend it to everyone because everybody has different personalities. But for us, it's worked really well to just be lighthearted about things and just not take to heart what people say to you if they are being negative. If somebody is accusing you of causing your child's autism, just know and be confident in yourself that you did not cause it. Like it's just something that is kind of like that. What's that saying about water off your back or rolling off your back? Whatever it's called. I don't know. I don't know turtle metaphors. But for me, I'm just like, you can say what you want to say. You're entitled to your opinion, but I don't have to agree with you. And I'm okay with that. Like, I'm okay with not agreeing with what you have to say. I heard what you had to say. I'm not going to take it to heart and I'm just going to move on.
right. Maybe you're thinking of water under the bridge.
No,
Is
there's
there something
something
about
about
a
rolling off
back?
your back. Somebody who's listening out there, make sure you go to our
Uh,
YouTube at Autism Wish
and
and
tell us
type
what
in the
the
comments. Yes,
idiom
please let us
is.
know. Let us know what the saying is that I'm trying to remember. I know that it's a real saying.
Okay, we'll go with that.
But yeah, that's basically what I've learned through my experience. It's just to not really let it get to you. And again, my first go to is essentially to try to kindly educate. So if somebody tries to say 3 lemons causes autism, you shouldn't have had those lemons while you were pregnant, then I will go and do like a Google Scholar research, not just a Google, but like Scholar where you're looking at the actual scientific literature and pull up the 3 studies that showed, hey, we tested whether or not lemons influence autism and it showed that there's no correlation or causation. Then I would be like, hey, here's some articles, some scientific literature that shows this is actually not the case. And it's actually a common misconception. Just wanted to let you know because I felt like this was a conversation we had to have. And if they want to accept it, then they accept it and you guys can move on and have a great relationship. If they're going to insist that it's still your fault beyond that point, then you're getting into kind of like toxic territory and you probably, at least I wouldn't want to entertain those conversations because what's the point? They're just harmful.
Yeah, I think whenever I encounter someone, it really is like, what is the like value of the relationship with that individual? Like, if it's someone who I want to obviously like maintain a relationship with, I'll like listen and be like, okay, like I don't really think that, or I'll just kind of like roll it off, like, oh, okay, I didn't know that lemons have that impact. Like, that's good to know.
I'm too autistic to do that. I would
Well,
not be able to fake it.
I'm just like, That's why I don't do lemonade. I don't know, um, but like, I'll just kind of like, I don't know, like humor them because I'm like, okay, me starting a huge argument, it's not going to do anything if they're that set in stone that lemons are the cause. And if it's someone like that I don't really care about, then I don't really care what my response is. I can be like, that's not how that works, but if you think that is, like, go nuts. So like,
That's so funny because we have like polar opposite approaches.
well, like I feel like, yeah, I mean, because at the end of the day, like I mean, depending on the person, it really is like how you want to like gauge it. Like if it's like someone who you're never going to see again, it's like at the park, then I'm kind of like, okay, like, so I'll go over here and play, but I don't know. That's just my personality.
Yeah. So, really, at the end of the day, it's your comfort level and your personality, whether you feel comfortable discussing with somebody how that makes you feel and like going through that connection of like, hey, when you say these things, it really bothers me because blah, 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 blah. If you have that relationship, then that's the route I would personally take because I am the open, blunt, honest type, and I'm the one who will confront to tell people exactly how I feel and think. But not everyone is like that. And so if you're more Matt's type, maybe you're the type who just will go with the flow and then talk about it later with your spouse or sibling or whoever. Whatever works for you, but just at the end of the day, try not to let it get to you. And if you can't change that person's mind, we just like move on and focus on other things because we feel like that is not really worth our emotional energy.
Yeah, because I mean, there's no like way to resolve it. It's just like stuck. So
Yeah.
might as well not waste your energy on it.
Yep. So that's all we have for this topic. Just wanted to give you a friendly reminder to check out the wonderful fundraiser by visiting autismwish.org and clicking on that Wonderful Wagon fundraiser link for a chance to win the green VW4 Wonderful Wagon, courtesy of DME provider Babies on Broadway. And that will all go to help support our autism program. So don't wait, give today, and the winner will be drawn once we reach our fundraising goal. And that's all we have for today's episode. So please let us know. Have you experienced parent shaming? What is the worst thing that someone has told you, and how did that make you feel? And what do you wish people knew about parenting autistic children? Make sure you share your thoughts in the comments on YouTube or Facebook at Autism Wish, or continue the conversation with us on our private Embracing Autism community. And don't forget to become a member today at autismwish.org for exclusive access to that community where you can get help and support our mission while finding your tribe. Thanks again for hanging out, and we will see you all next time.
Bye.
Bye.